The people here, generally speaking, are the vilest race of men upon the earth. They have neither honor, nor honesty, nor religion enough to entitle them to any tolerable character, being a perfect medley or hodgepodge, made up of bankrupt pirates, decayed libertines, sectaries, and enthusiasts of all sorts who have transported themselves hither, and are the most factious and seditious people in the whole world. Those are the words of an Anglican minister. The location he was talking about? Why, it was none other than the next colony on our list, the subtropical nightmare of South Carolina. Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 15, Locke of the Carolinas. Last time, we began the story of the province of Carolina, a new English colony created after the restoration of Charles II. We heard about the unruly settlers of North Carolina, poor but independent immigrants from Virginia. Today, we're going to look at the very different origins of South Carolina, which has its roots not in the Chesapeake, but in the sugar plantations of Barbados. But the story of Carolina intersects with the story of John Locke, one of the most important political thinkers ever, so I'm going to discuss him as well, along with some other important English philosophers at the time. The mid-1600s were crucial for the history of English political thought, and thus for American political thought as well. The American colonies were growing and coming into existence right at the time modern ideas about government were coming into focus, as religious factionalism was replaced with ideological factionalism. Men like Locke were read and discussed by the founders of the United States, and their ideas shape debate even today, so I want to introduce some of them early. We begin by returning yet again to the periphery of the English Civil War. But instead of the swampy Chesapeake or stony New England, this part of our story begins in Paris with the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was in his 50s when war broke out in England, and he was riding out the storm in a self-imposed French exile. He was known to the intellectuals of his day. He had met Galileo, and he had corresponded with Descartes, who thought that he had, quote, wicked views. After the Restoration, he would debate the leading scientists of the Royal Society. But he was as yet a minor figure. It was his 1651 book, Leviathan, that made him both famous and infamous. Leviathan was a work of political philosophy, inspired in large part by the chaos that was engulfing England. Hobbes wanted to understand what it took to make a state stable. To do that, he needed to understand the fundamental source of political authority, what justified the existence of a state which had the right to coerce its subjects into obedience. The traditional answer in Europe was the divine right of kings. God had ordained some men to rule, and all others to obey. But Hobbes was a relatively secular thinker, and so the divine right of kings was unsatisfying to him. The answer he came up with won't surprise listeners of this podcast. Hobbes asked his readers to imagine what life was like in a state of nature, how people lived in a time before political authority, when each man was his own master. According to Hobbes, life in a state of nature was terrible, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as he famously put it. Without a state to punish bad behavior, all men had to fend for themselves in an anarchic, never-ending struggle. And so it was in the interest of everyone to submit themselves to a government with absolute authority. Hopefully the state would be governed well, but even tyranny is better than anarchy. Thus, the state was justified as a social contract between individuals. Everyone was better off with the government. And even if a state hadn't formed by explicit agreement like that, the same logic of avoiding anarchy still applied. That's an oversimplification of Hobbes, but it's the basic idea. Of course, we already saw New Englanders drawing up social contracts for the same reasons, so practice preceded theory in this instance. I don't know whether or not Hobbes was aware of those examples, though. In any case, Hobbes' ideas set off an intellectual firestorm. It wasn't so much that he'd advocated for absolute power, although that was unpopular with parliamentarians. It was that he had given an account of government which had little to no use for God. His arguments were centered wholly around self-interest. He was even accused of being an atheist. But despite all the insults launched at Hobbes, it was his work that set the terms of the debate going forward. From now on, thinkers would be arguing about social contracts and the state of nature. Enter John Locke. Locke was born in 1632, more than 40 years after Hobbes, so he was just a boy during the English Civil War. He was born to Puritan parents and his father fought for Parliament. Locke went to Oxford where he studied medicine and became acquainted with modern philosophy and science. He knew scientists like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and Christian Huygens, and later became a member of the famous Royal Society. He was, in intellectual terms, a very modern man. But it would be many decades before he made his own mark on philosophy. First, there was his involvement with Carolina. While in London, he met Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury was impressed with the young man and hired him as his personal physician/secretary/advisor. Now, Shaftesbury, as it happened, had an interest in colonization. His father had been involved in the Virginia Company, and now that Charles was back on the throne, the time seemed ripe for expansion in the New World. Shaftesbury became involved in the expansion of the mercantile system, and therefore so did Locke. Locke was made secretary to the Board of Trade and Plantations, a new agency created to collect information on the colonies. So he was very much near the center of things. Shaftesbury also became one of those 8 men who pushed Charles into creating the province of Carolina in 1663. As we've seen, although Carolina was vast, it was mostly unsettled by Europeans. The Albemarle settlement in North Carolina never amounted to much as far as the Lords Proprietor were concerned. The harbor was bad and rents were too high relative to Virginia, so not many migrants came. And outside of Northern Carolina, colonization had been even less impressive. The proprietors had hoped to sit back and just let others start new settlements on their behalf. There were a few attempts, but they'd all come to nothing. So, the proprietors decided to take a more active hand in promoting migration. Well, at least one proprietor did, Shaftesbury. He got the others to contribute to the outfitting of an expedition to South Carolina. If you want something done right, do it yourself. He also decided to come up with a new constitution for the province, since the previous government, for those failed colonies, had always been inadequate. So he, with the assistance of John Locke, drafted what became known as the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina. Historians disagree about the authorship of the Fundamental Constitutions, but Locke was probably responsible for at least a good deal of it, so I'm going to talk as though it was primarily his work. Which it may have been. It would hardly be surprising for someone with such a political mind to have taken the lead, but we just don't know. He certainly had a hand in it. So, what sort of constitution did one of the most influential political philosophers of all time come up with? Was it a dramatic break with the past? Not really. There were some innovations, but those weren't actually very successful. One of the inspirations for the fundamental constitutions was a book called The Commonwealth of Oceania. Oceania had been written by the Republican James Harrington, another of the many philosophers produced by the English Civil War. Oceania, which was published during Cromwell's Protectorate, was a work of utopian political philosophy. It described the workings of an imaginary nation, Oceania, an ideal constitutional republic. He covered all sorts of ideas, from rotation in office to secret ballots to ensuring that there was a large population of landowners as the basis for political stability. The society of Oceania was divided into 3 classes: lords, freeholders, and servants. So a republic, but one with an aristocracy. In a sense, the king was simply replaced by the Constitution, as the center of power. I suppose to a modern reader it seems quite radical in some respects, while surprisingly respectful of the status quo in others. Certainly the combination of republicanism and a hereditary nobility seems incongruous today. There were plenty of works like Oceania being published around this time. Authors like Hobbes and Harrington, and later Locke, were all trying to rebuild their understanding of government from the ground up, to avoid the preconceived notions of the medieval past. Radical groups like the Levelers and the Diggers wished to transform not just government, but all of society. Change was in the air, and ideas were flying around with unprecedented speed, as a man like Locke would have been well aware. As for Harrington himself, he was thrown into the Tower of London after the Restoration for his troubles, and only escaped real punishment thanks to bribery. Some of the themes of Oceania are repeated in the fundamental constitutions. the threefold division of society, and the importance of land distribution to political power especially. For example, 2/5 of land was allotted to the lords, and the rest to common freeholders, in order to balance the political power of both classes. But of course, Locke was writing on behalf of powerful lords, and so the constitutions could not simply follow some utopian plan. The stated purpose of the fundamental constitutions was, quote, "for the better settlement of the government of the said place, and establishing the interest of the lords proprietors, with equality and without confusion, and that the government of this province may be made most agreeable to the monarchy, under which we live, and of which this province is a part, and that we may avoid erecting a numerous democracy." From this statement alone, we can see that this isn't going to be a terribly radical document, even if it had some radical inspirations. The Lords Proprietor themselves were the source of all authority in Carolina. They could overturn laws passed in America as they wished. If any of them went to Carolina, then he could make himself governor. But that only happened once, mostly they just sent deputies instead, and so the governor was appointed from among the greater landowners in the colony. Like in Maryland, the Lords Proprietor of Carolina were given the right to create their own aristocracy. There's a lot of discussion of baronies and manors and inheritance. And the proprietorship was hereditary. Each of these 8 men's heirs would themselves become Lord Proprietor someday. Locke himself received the hereditary title of Landgrave, not that it ever amounted to anything. There was to be an assembly, consisting of the governor and either the Lords Proprietor or their representatives, along with the nobility of Carolina, plus representatives elected by the freeholders, not freemen, of the colony every 2 years, all meeting together in a single body. Voting required possession of 50 acres of land, while sitting in the assembly required 500. Voting was to be by ballot, unusually. There was also a rather complicated Grand Council, another idea borrowed from Harrington. All legislation in the assembly had to be passed by the Grand Council first, which significantly limited the assembly's independence. According to Robert M. Weir, quote, "The proprietors sought to ensure the stability of Carolina by anchoring the political system in the possession of land, balancing the distribution of power accordingly, and then making the superstructure as rigid as possible." Unusually for the southern colonies, there was to be some level of local self-government. The householders of each town were to elect a 24-man council. That council would then choose from itself a smaller group of aldermen, and a mayor would be chosen from those aldermen by the deputies of the proprietors. Again, an overly complicated way of doing things, where popular participation was checked by other forces. Professional lawyers were banned, a practice they apparently copied from Virginia. Religious toleration was guaranteed, so long as you belonged to any organized religion that believed in God. Even, quote, "Jews, heathens, and other dissenters from the purity of Christian religion were to be protected." And special provision was made so that Quakers wouldn't have to swear oaths. This was done not just because Locke was a firm believer in toleration, although he was, but also out of a desire to attract immigrants. As Wesley Craven interestingly points out, many traditionally American liberties have their origins in the economic interests of promoters trying to get men to their colonies by making them more appealing. The constitutions were rather more complex than the other provincial governments in America. Like Maryland, this was in part another attempt to transplant the English class structure to the New World. The fundamental constitutions were, I think, and this is my own speculation, an effort, conscious or not, to synthesize 3 things: English tradition, contemporary political philosophy, and the practices already in place in America. But of those 3 things, it was mostly just the practices already in place in America that would stick. With the constitutions written and the preparations complete, a small fleet of 3 ships left England. After a stop in the Caribbean, it arrived in Carolina in early 1670, carrying some 140 colonists. They were some 300 miles to the southwest of the Albemarle, and about 800 miles from Boston. The site they had chosen, which would become known as Charleston, had an excellent harbor, and so it was a natural point of settlement. The colony survived with no major disasters. There were now men with experience in colonization, and there was now a denser network of outposts in the Americas to trade with, both of which helped in avoiding starvation. Within 2 years of the founding of Charleston, there were hundreds of settlers, 2/3 of them adult men, with the rest split about evenly between women and children. The colonists experimented with crops, figuring out what would work best in Carolina's soil. Tobacco was out, but rice and indigo both grew nicely, and those would become Carolina's main cash crops. Now, the proprietors recognized that the fundamental constitutions were far too elaborate to be useful in such a small colony, so they hedged their bets. They told the colonists to only put into place the parts of the constitutions that were practicable, with the expectation that, over time, the constitutions would be fully enacted. That first year, the government consisted of a Grand Council of the governor, the deputies of the proprietors, and 5 men elected by the freemen. This council was then supposed to help elect an assembly of 20 men, but there were too few freemen to fill the offices, and so the elections were delayed until the next year. From the start, there was bickering and scheming. There were disputes about election procedures. The first governor, who was quite old, died in 1671, and there was a contest between 2 men for the governorship until the proprietors resolved the issue. Assemblies were elected from that next year onward, but they were never very obedient to the wills of the proprietors. You'd think the proprietors would have learned from the unruliness of all the other legislatures in America, but I guess not. Despite the repeated request of the Lords Proprietor for the Assembly to pass the constitutions into law, the Assembly kept delaying. They had no interest in anything so elaborate and ill-suited to their colony. The Lords Proprietor revised the Constitution several times, with the help of Locke, in order to appease them, but it was to no avail. By the early 1700s, they were dead for good. Of course, some provisions like the property requirements were kept, and elections continued to be held at a regular date, rather than just whenever the governor called for them. But in practice, I'd say that things mostly just came to resemble the other slaveholding colonies. The Assembly fought for and won the right to initiate legislation instead of the Grand Council. The legislatures of both North and South Carolina became bicameral in 1691. So similar enough to Virginia in practice. Elections to the Assembly were run somewhat differently, though. The counties in South Carolina were so big that church parishes became the seats of election, rather than the county courthouse or something like that. In fact, church wardens were generally in charge of administering elections. And elections were held over 2 days, from 8 to 12 in the morning and then from 2 to 6 in the evening. Voting was still done by ballot, thanks to the fundamental constitutions. I'm not sure if elections to town councils were kept from the constitutions, but I don't think so. So, like in the Chesapeake, elections to the Assembly were probably the only sort of voting in Carolina. Locke's constitution was pretty clearly a failure. In fairness to Locke, it was never really put into practice, but even if it had been, it's hard to imagine it working. Firstly, the would-be aristocrats of South Carolina never took to calling themselves aristocrats. They were aristocratic to be sure, as we'll see, but they weren't proper aristocrats. It just didn't take. Perhaps it's because that, although they were landed elites, their relationship to the land was purely one of business, rather than of tradition and family heritage. It's harder to have a family estate if you're always buying and selling parts of it. I don't know. Secondly, the constitutions were too complicated and perhaps too inflexible for the dynamism of a rapidly growing colony. Although the document was modernizing in ways, in other ways it feels more like an attempt to rationalize an increasingly archaic form of government, so that it can be transplanted to virgin soil. It both went too far and didn't go far enough. Despite being consciously planned, it's considerably less radical than what was happening in New England. Less radical, perhaps, even than what had emerged in the Chesapeake. Too much theory, too much tradition. Or at least that's my guess. Not that their failure really made a difference. Carolina learned from other colonies what worked and emulated that. So despite the contributions of such an important political theorist, practice remained more important than theory when it came to government. No, John Locke did not leave a mark on Carolina. What did then? Was it just a carbon copy of Virginia? No, actually. For the most part, the settlers didn't come from either England or Virginia. Instead, they came from the English colonies in the Caribbean, in particular from the island of Barbados. During the 1670s, maybe half of all settlers in South Carolina came from the Caribbean, and through 1737, nearly half of Carolina's governors were from there or were sons of immigrants from there. So, more than anywhere else, it was Barbados that created the culture of South Carolina. What sort of culture was that? I think that the short answer is, like Virginia, but more so. I haven't mentioned the colonies in the Caribbean too much, since they didn't become part of the United States, but at the time they were far more important than New England or the Chesapeake, and they attracted tens of thousands more migrants than either region on the mainland. This was all thanks to sugar. Sugar was one of those always-in-demand commodities that planters could make huge fortunes on, and Barbados had the most developed plantation system in the region. Barbados was first colonized by the English in the 1620s, along with some other islands in the Caribbean. When sugarcane was introduced, the settlers found that it grew tremendously well, and very rapidly, sugar plantations sprung up across the region. But they sprung up most rapidly in Barbados. Unfortunately, work on a sugar plantation was miserable and horribly dangerous. As a result, slavery took off quickly in Barbados, much more so than in mainland British America. The planters brought in shipload after shipload of African slaves, because the cheapest thing to do was to just work them to death and import replacements every few years. Even by the standards of New World slavery, slavery in the Caribbean was astonishingly terrible. Slaves in Barbados died at twice the rate of those in Virginia. Politically speaking, Barbados was a proprietorship owned by the Earl of Carlisle, but in practice it ran its own affairs for the most part. From 1639 onwards, there was a representative assembly of the freeholders, as well as an appointed governor and appointed councillors, very similar to Virginia. And during the Protectorate, Barbados had similarly gone through a period of legislative ascendancy, with a much weakened governorship. After the Restoration, Charles II took direct control of the colony, much as his father had in Virginia in the 1620s. So although the specifics were different, the government was similar enough to that in Virginia, at least in form. South Carolina had a different origin than the other southern colonies, but I don't wish to overstate the differences. They were all similar enough politically, and they drew from the same pool of ideas. Now, Barbados is a small island, so it didn't take long for the planters to run out of land. Hence, moving to Carolina, with its vast uncolonized stretches, was a natural decision, especially for younger sons of wealthy families. They were involved in some of the earlier attempts at colonizing Carolina, as well as the successful one. And once Charleston was founded, they just kept on coming, importing their culture along with them. Most obviously, slavery was present in South Carolina from the very start. Whereas in 1670 only 5% of Virginia's population was enslaved, in South Carolina that number quickly hit 25% and kept climbing. And that meant that all of slavery's inhumanity was only magnified. Barbados had a reputation for extraordinary cruelty, and that carried over to Carolina. Punishments for runaway slaves included whipping, branding, castration, having the Achilles tendon severed, and death. On the other hand, the fine for killing someone else's slave was £50, according to Colin Woodard, quote, about the cost of a good gentleman's wig. These sorts of practices would spread from Carolina to become standard across the South in the 1700s, but we'll get to that in much later episodes. Unlike in Virginia, where the racial caste system took time to develop, it was present in South Carolina from the start, and racial boundaries there were more rigorously enforced. Race mixing, even just eating together, was seen as abhorrent. And that's to say nothing of the fear of interracial relationships, though of course men raping their slaves was common. With such a large slave population, paranoia about revolts and intermixing were always sky high, so the two populations had to be kept as separate as possible. And the free black population was much smaller than in the Chesapeake. The fundamental constitutions made race-based slavery explicit from the start. Each planter was to be given 150 acres for each slave or servant they brought. One article stated that, quote, every freeman of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves, of what opinion or religion soever. This was to ensure that conversion to Christianity wasn't enough to free slaves. South Carolina also took the lead in enslaving its Indian population. As late as 1708, for instance, a full third of the 4,300 slaves in the colony were Indian. and South Carolina exported so many Indian slaves that in 1715, a number of colonies in New England banned any more imports from Carolina. Surprisingly, however, the vote wasn't officially restricted to whites until about 1715. And we know for a fact that at least some black men were voting in South Carolina, because we have records of people complaining about it to the Assembly in 1703 and 1704. According to the petition, quote, "Free Negroes were received and taken as good electors as the best freeholders in the province." They also complained that Jews were voting, by the way. We saw something similar in Virginia, where despite the existence of discriminatory laws, in local communities it was not uncommon for wealthier free blacks to have some measure of power. It also took a long time for Virginia to add explicit racial qualifications for voting. As racism became institutionalized, these ambiguities would disappear. But do remember that in the early years, although there was undeniably a huge racial divide, things could be more complicated on the ground. Apart from that racial divide, there was also a great deal of economic inequality. The wealthiest planters were some of the wealthiest men in all of the Americas, but many whites were dirt poor. But even so, it was not uncommon for poorer whites to own at least a few slaves, thus giving them more of a stake in the racial caste system. There were also complaints about servants voting, so we know that that happened at least sometimes, in defiance of the law. The planter elite loved to play up their connections to the English aristocracy, following all the latest fashionable trends in clothing, architecture, you name it. They visited London and sent their children to top-notch English universities. They wished to be as elite as possible. Richard S. Dunn called their culture, quote, "a remarkable compound of old-world elegance and frontier boisterousness." It's surprising that they didn't adopt the titles of nobility Carolina had to offer, but for whatever reason, they didn't. Unlike in Virginia where the planters lived spread out from one another, in South Carolina the planters preferred to stick to Charleston and leave the management of their plantations to overseers. Charleston quickly became one of the most populous cities in North America. Even during the American Revolution, it was the biggest city south of Philadelphia, numbering maybe 15,000 residents. In fact, other than Baltimore, Maryland, it was the only city in the South with a population above 4,000. So remember that when I talk about how rural the South was, I mean rural. Like rural. Charleston's size was due in large part to its advantageous location. It had a good harbor and was close to the Caribbean, which gave it an advantage in trade, especially in the slave trade. In fact, some 40% of the slaves imported into the United States came through Charleston's port. But although South Carolina was proving more attractive to settlers than North Carolina, it was still a disappointment to the proprietors. The colonists were just as unruly as their counterparts in the Albemarle. They launched major wars against the Indians and enslaved them, in blatant disregard of orders from the proprietors to keep the peace. In the eyes of the proprietors, the colonists were proving difficult and ungrateful, after all the money they'd invested and the rents they'd waived. So they tried attracting more migrants by recruiting religious dissenters, such as the Huguenots, French Protestants who were fleeing a crackdown by their Catholic government. Some 500 Huguenots came to South Carolina, and they actually formed a reasonable percentage of the population for a time. At first they were largely excluded from elections and from government as foreigners, but soon enough they swore allegiance to England and were naturalized. Quickly enough after that, Huguenots were serving in the Assembly. They also tried to attract English dissenters. In the 1680s, they named a dissenter, Joseph Morton, as governor, for instance, and at least a few hundred dissenters came. They even changed the electoral procedures of the colony in order to give the areas that had been settled by dissenters disproportionately large representation in the Assembly. Partly, the proprietors wished to weaken the independence of the planters from Barbados. It was hoped that the Huguenots and other dissenters would be more favorable to proprietary interests. But as we'll see in later episodes, things didn't really work out the way they'd hoped. The original Lords Proprietor died off quickly enough, and were replaced by their heirs, who had no particular interest in Carolina except as some property that they happened to own. So administration naturally remained within Carolina itself. Over time, the proprietors sold off their rights to the crown and eventually lost all influence. As for Locke himself, he remained attached to Shaftesbury and his family for the rest of his life, and his fortunes rose and fell alongside them. In the 1670s, Shaftesbury became involved in the Titus Oates hoax, a crazy anti-Catholic conspiracy which I don't have time to get into here, but which I highly recommend looking up since it's pretty wild. He was also involved in unsuccessful attempts to keep Charles's Catholic brother James from inheriting the throne. Anyway, Shaftesbury wound up imprisoned in the Tower of London twice, and eventually went into exile in Holland. Locke followed a few years later, only returning after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which overthrew James II. After his return, he anonymously published his most important work of political philosophy, the Two Treatises of Government, as well as other important books that don't concern us here. The first of the two treatises is a refutation of the divine right of kings. Instead, he favored the social contract. But unlike Hobbes, who believed that subjects surrendered all their rights to a sovereign, Locke held that the people retained natural rights, and the government was thus fundamentally limited in its reach. It could enforce the peace, but not by violating natural rights. Those limits are the subject of the second treatise. Let's return to Hobbes's state of nature, a state of anarchy with no government or laws. What is there to restrict our behavior, other than self-interest? Hobbes would say nothing, more or less, but Locke had a different answer. He argued that even in a state of nature our actions could be morally constrained by natural rights. What are natural rights? Natural rights are rights which all individuals have, regardless of culture or religion or anything else, and which are discoverable purely through reason. Anybody thinking about it properly would come to the same conclusion. According to Locke, we are all equal, and we all wish to survive and flourish. From those basic premises, natural rights are derived. For Locke, these rights were still connected with and ultimately derived from God, but from a sort of deistic God, rather than one specific to any particular religion. For instance, when the Declaration of Independence declares that, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That's a classic statement of natural rights, and one that was influenced by Locke. Natural rights are self-evident and unalienable. So for Locke, even in a state of nature, people still had natural rights. Those rights might be hard to realize in practice, but they nevertheless existed in principle. The reason people came together to form governments was to protect those natural rights and to pursue public goods, rather than merely for self-defense, as with Hobbes. This placed natural limits on the power of the sovereign. After all, if the government starts violating people's natural rights with impunity, then it's acting in a way contrary to its stated reason for existence, and can therefore be justifiably overthrown in a revolution. These limits also had implications for the structure of government. Locke advocated a separation of powers, although he didn't think of the judiciary as a separate branch of government. He also believed that government should be representative, though not necessarily at all levels. In all of this, Locke's understanding of government is very reminiscent of how the founders of the United States generally thought about things. Of course, to single out Locke like this is an oversimplification of history. Locke was indeed read carefully by the Founding Fathers, but there were other similar thinkers, influential in their time, but forgotten today. Take poor Algernon Sidney, a contemporary of Locke, who was executed in the 1680s, partly for a plot against the king's life. Thomas Jefferson cited him, alongside, quote, Aristotle, Cicero, and Locke, in terms of his importance, yet he's hardly thought of today. It's understandable why we use Locke as a stand-in for a whole generation of political thought, but it is an oversimplification. Just so you know. Anyway, Locke's ideas may sound pretty good, depending on your own political philosophy, but there's an obvious gap here. Slavery. Surely it was a violation of natural rights for one man to enslave another. According to Locke, for the most part, yes. He allowed that slavery was an acceptable punishment for prisoners of war, who would otherwise be executed, since slavery is at least better than death, but that's it. Certainly he didn't come up with a theory justifying the intergenerational racial slavery of the New World. He apparently didn't hold that there were any differences between the races which might justify enslavement. And yet, of course, the fundamental constitutions of Carolina explicitly authorize slavery. Those passages may or may not have been written by Locke himself, but the discrepancy remains. Slavery plus a hereditary aristocracy are hardly the elements of lofty theory. And it's hard to dismiss the constitutions as just work he did for hire or something. Locke himself praised them as being the very, quote, model and form of government. So how did Locke reconcile these two positions? In practice, he seems to have just passed over slavery without commenting on it too much one way or the other. Historians have argued about Locke's true beliefs, but if I had to guess, I'd say that slavery was simply a distant issue to him, confined to the reports he read on America. A distasteful injustice, perhaps, but one among many, and certainly not one that had the terrible weight we give it today. It may have just not been an especially big deal to him. And no matter his personal feelings, pushing too hard on the issue could have cost him his job. But that's pure speculation. I don't know more than anyone else. In any case, Locke's inability to overcome the divide between the equality implied by natural rights and the inequality that actually existed in practice in America did not bode well for the future of the United States. His New World disciples would be even less successful in embodying their self-declared ideals. And sometimes, when you declare that all men are created equal, people will take you at your word. As for Locke himself, after the publication of his major philosophical works, he spent a few more years on the Board of Trade, overseeing England's colonies. He died in 1704. Next episode, we'll be moving up north to the Middle Colonies, that is, all of the provinces between the Chesapeake and New England. Before they became English possessions, the Middle Colonies were part of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. But I'm going to go back even further than that, to discuss the politics of the Iroquois Confederacy, the most sophisticated government in what would become the United States. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode at the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.